massive landowner in Scotland. All they had to do was support the Bruces on the throne. Now, both men met in a church, right, because it's a sacred place. Remember, these guys don't trust each other, they don't like each other. And so they meet in a sacred place where no harm can come to either man. But because of that, of course, history being history and only two men in there, we don't know what was said, we don't know what happened exactly. But we can piece it together with the fact that Bruce walked out of the church with blood all over his dagger. He looked at his best mate, it was a guy called James Douglas, and said, "I think I have killed the Red Cummin." At which James Douglas looked at him and said, "What do you mean you think you've killed him?" And he went in and finished the job for Bruce. So now what we've got is effectively a new king that has brought a man to harm in a church. Right? It's not a good way of getting the support of your country. And so Bruce, without the support of his country, he took his crown anyway, and he tried to carry on doing what Wallace had started with his guerrilla warfare against the English. However, he was losing. He didn't have the same support. And without the same support that Wallace had, he was losing left, right and centre, and eventually he found himself out on the west coast on an island. Now, since the Vikings had been booted out, the west coast was very different, because they controlled all the islands out there, they pretty much owned all the islands out there, and so they had a sort of different style of life. Even after the Vikings left, a lot of them had settled and stayed, and so the way of life was still very different out there. So they kind of had their own leader, a title that isn't actually in existence at that point, but it's developed later. It's too close to the Vikings at that point. But a title that comes later, which would have been given to this man if the times had been different, was Lord of the Isles. Alright, and so a very, very powerful man on the west coast. And with that, the Lord of the Isles, a man named Angus Ogg, or Angus the Young, went to meet with Robert the Bruce while he was living in a cave out on an island on the west. And he basically approached him and said, "What are you doing?" He said, "You're meant to be the king. You're meant to be the king. You're losing battles left, right and centre, and you're living in a cave on my island. Like, well, that's not the acts of a king. Come on, hey, start winning something." And he said, "Look, I can't. So the country doesn't support me. What the country doesn't understand is that what I did for the country. If I'd let John Cummin live, then he would have sided with the English before siding with the Bruces, and if that had happened, well then we'd never get an independent Scotland again." And with that, Angus Ogg sided with sided with Bruce, and believed that what he had done in the interest of the country, and therefore he now had the support of the west coast. And with that support, he started doing what he was doing again, hit and running. Now this time he was winning. And it came to 3 castles in particular that he needed to take. One was Perth, one was Edinburgh, and one was Stirling. So he started with Perth, and it was fantastic. He took it like a ninja in the night, made sure no word got there, and then when he arrived, he managed to get rope ladders in very quietly, and then before they knew it, they were under attack, and it was taken from the inside out. It was fantastic. So then comes Edinburgh. Edinburgh, he sends his brother Neil to get information. Neil comes back with basically a path up to the castle using the rock as opposed to the Royal Mile. And so they climbed up the north face of the cliff and managed to get in that way. So now Perth and Edinburgh are both taken. Right, things are looking good. So it comes to Stirling. Now Stirling is, as you've seen, very, very difficult to try and take. And with that being the case, this time he sends his brother Edward Bruce. Edward Bruce's job is to lay siege to this castle, but Edward is the wrong man for this job. He's a very, very impatient man, and he's more interested in getting his name stamped in history than he is of actually sort of thinking about things and doing things logically. And with that being the case, he decides to meet with the garrison commander, who is a man called Sir Philip Mowbray. Now, Sir Philip Mowbray he was in a bargaining position, because he had been so good at his job at defending Stirling Castle that, well, basically, he'd been left to it. And he was meant to have been relieved. He was meant to have gone home way before this, months before this. But his relieval party had never arrived, because he was good at his job. And so with that, he was in a position to bargain, and he said, "Right, well, I'll tell you what, if me and my men haven't been relieved by the summer, you can have it. All right, I'll give it back to you. And so what he's doing is putting a pressure on England to bring this to an end. The whole wars of independence. Bring it to an end, bring it to a crunch. And so Edward Bruce goes, yeah, all right, fair enough. And so what it does is give both sides time to raise an army, and it's going to come to a pitched battle, which is exactly what Scotland always tries to avoid. But one of the saving graces that while England were bringing their army north, as they were heading north to end this, their king, Edward I, he died. He died of, if I remember rightly, a recurring illness as well, actually. And he died of a recurring illness on the way up here, quite slowly and apparently quite painfully. And his son was left in charge, and his son was Edward II. Now, the best way to describe him, he wasn't half the man his father was. However, he was raised by his father. So he still believed Scotland to be his, he just wasn't as powerful or as forceful as his father was. So anyway, with that being the case, Edward II arrived with the largest army to ever invade Scotland. 22,000 men were brought up here. Robert the Bruce has only managed to muster up 4,000 men. So 22,000 against 4,000. Right? Lad Brooks would go mental with this. But Robert the Bruce, knowing the English's weakness and knowing the arrogance of an army of 22,000, chose the battlefield, and he chose a place called the Bannock Burn. Anyone remember what a burn was? The Scots word, burn? It's a stream or a small river. He's chosen a place where there's more water, and knowing fine well that the English never want to compete with water when being expected to fight, he chose a place where the river goes round. What he's done is basically forced the English to either go to the other side of the river or position themselves in the centre of that boat, where they can't go left, they cannot go right, they cannot go backwards. But there's 22,000, what are they going to need to move for? So they position themselves there, knowing fine well that that's where they were going to position themselves. He actually sends men down onto the field to dig trenches before the battle takes place. And what they've done is effectively built a medieval minefield. They've dug trenches, but they filled these trenches with spikes, and then they've covered them over. And so when it comes to the first day of battle, Edward II sends his cavalry, sends his horses, and they start to sink. And within 2 hours, he's recalled them, and he's ordered his men to go into the nearby towns and villages to recover